Debate, the honourable member for Toronto Centre.
Speaker, I appreciate the chance to speak in this debate, and I also want to indicate that our party will, of course, be supporting this motion. We'd like to see it strengthened. We'd like to make sure that, in fact, the motion refers not simply to next elections. We think 6 months is too long, and we also think it's got to apply to the election that we've just come out of. And so I will hope there can be some discussions among the parties to make sure that the motion is in fact strengthened. Mr. Speaker, just to put this issue in a bit of historical context, I was reading the wonderful book by Alan Taylor called The Civil War of 1812, which is, of course, we're all reading about the War of 1812 because it's our 200th anniversary. And in the course of that book, there's a wonderful description of how Simcoe recruited his Surveyor General David W. Smith to stand for an assembly seat in Essex County in 1792. And the book goes on to say that Smith entrusted electioneering to his wealthy friends, who campaigned in the traditional style by lavishing music, food, and alcohol rather than policy discussions upon the voters. A paternalist rather than an egalitarian, Smith advised his campaign manager, "Let the peasants have a fiddle, some beverage, and beef." Anticipating victory, he planned a culminating celebration, and I quote, "I beg that an ox be roasted, whole on the common, and a barrel of rum be given to the mob to wash down the beef." As Simcoe expected, the book goes on to say, Smith won his seat. Well, that's how politics was conducted in 1792 by the ancestors of the Tory party, which is now in place. But I'd like to simply bring that up to date, Mr. Speaker, by drawing attention to a comment that was made to me by a well-known conservative who I will not name. And he said to me, quote, "Give me a computer and give me an internet access, and I can boom your house and cell phone from 3 continents away at the same time with the same or different message." So it's the same party, it's just a different technology. As opposed to ox and booze, nylons and rum, we have a new way of reaching people. Give me a computer and an internet access, and I can boom your house and boom your cell phone. Mr. Speaker, we have to understand how politics has in fact changed and become such a technology-driven system, but behind every technology there still are the human values as to how we in fact campaign and how we relate to voters and what are the limits. The Canadian way has been a way in which we said we need to have clear laws, we need to have clear accountability, we need to make sure that people are held to account for the things that they say, that there are limits to how much an individual can spend in each riding, and there are limits to how much parties can spend, as we all know. Now, this basic practice in Canada has only been challenged by one party and actually by one person, because it was in another life that the current Prime Minister in fact challenged this system and said, we don't want this system, we want the American system. We want a system where anyone can spend whatever money they want. We want a system where there's unlimited access to dough, and that's the kind of system we want for Canada. And in that case, known as Harper versus Canada, I have to mention the name because it's in the title of the lawsuit, Harper v. Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada said no. It's actually reasonable and fair for Canadians to limit the ability of third parties to spend as much money as they want in the course of an election campaign. It's that same Prime Minister who, again in another life, described the people in Elections Canada as jackasses. It's the same Prime Minister who, as Prime Minister, led his party through the so-called in-and-out scandal, and a refusal by this party day after day after day in question period to recognize the problem, to refuse to provide the information, to force Elections Canada to go to court, to get the documents from the government, from the party, and finally, after a 5-year process, cop a plea, accept the fact that they've done wrong, pay back the money to the government, and pay a fine as well. Mr. Speaker, that has become the culture of the Conservative Party of Canada. And in carrying out that culture, they have, at the same time, and it has to be said very clearly, created a very, very complex but nevertheless effective system of communicating with voters across the country. Now, the Minister of State just gave his ritual response, I think in the course of his speech, in an answer to his questions, and an answer to the questions that were made yesterday by the Parliamentary Secretary, the robo-response king of the House of Commons at the moment. He said that our party and other parties paid millions of dollars to make hundreds of thousands of calls. Of course we did. So did the Conservative Party. That is the common technique which is now used by all political parties. Yep. Some of the calls are made in person by phone banks. Some of them are so-called robocalls. Some of them are teletown halls where people are in fact brought together to listen to a conversation with a political leader or with a candidate. That's one of the techniques that we use. But what has to be clear, Mr. Speaker, is that all of these systems can, of course, be abused, just as there have been abuses in the past. And the question is our Elections Act keeping up with the abuses and the potential abuses? And in fact, are we now able to say that we have a system of regulation and of law, of real accountability to public authorities, which is in fact equal to the technologies which are there? There is nothing wrong with a robocall per se. There is nothing wrong with somebody phoning up and saying, I'm calling on behalf of the Conservative Party, and I'd like to ask you how you intend to vote in the next election. And the voter can say either, go away, I don't want to be annoyed, or they can say, here's the information. There's nothing wrong with either of those things. In fact, when I hear this called the so-called robocall issue, it's not really about robocalls, it's about misleading calls. It's about misinformation in calls. It's not even, Mr. Speaker, about a call which is in fact unpleasant, a call which says that your Liberal candidate or your New Democratic Party candidate has done this, this, and this, and this. There are all kinds of negative things that are said during a campaign. We've all been in all candidates' debates. Every member in the House has been in an all candidates debate. When somebody on the other side said something we object to, we don't think it's true. We've all seen leaflets which say negative things about our party or about our candidates or about our leaders. There's a difference between hardball, tough politics, even negative politics, and dishonest politics. And we have to understand where the line is to be drawn. There's tough things that are said. There's things that are said that we might think are unfair. I happen to think that many of the things that are said, that were said about our former leaders, were very unfair. I think they help to suppress votes and discourage voters. They create a climate in which negativity is there, but I wouldn't say they were illegal. J'ai des objections de temps en temps.
I sometimes object to things that are said that are not fair, in my opinion. The publicity or advertisements about our leaders was harsh, and I'm sure that the New Democrats and Conservatives will say that they saw unfair advertising about themselves. But the problem is that there's a difference between a harsh policy or harsh politics and dishonest politics. Politics that are negative and politics based on fraud. And that's the question facing Elections Canada right now. I'm sure that the speech made by the minister will be repeated by all the Conservative members speaking today. They will repeat and repeat and repeat. But let me say, quite simply, that right now it's the Conservative Party that's subject of an investigation. They are under court order to produce documents. They have no choice. They must offer these documents. We said we're prepared to cooperate fully with Elections Canada and provide it with all the information we have, unquestioningly. I can say that very clearly. That will be done by the Liberal Party, no problem. But we have to say the exact nature of the problems we're having. We have examples of calls that are inexplicable, and explanations must be found. There are examples of a very centralized system, that's the Conservative system. A very centralized system, it's very philosophy and organization. And what we have to consider is, how can this be explained? How do you explain calls to Jewish families during Passover, or families that received messages saying that the person comes from the Liberal Party? These weren't robocalls. These were calls from actual human beings saying that they were calling on behalf of the Liberal Party, when we know. An example I can give you was in the riding of Mount Royal. The office of my colleague from Mount Royal was closed at the time. They didn't make any calls. So there has to be an explanation. If there are many other ridings where this is also the case, well, it's difficult to say that's a coincidence.
Say, well, this is clearly a rogue situation. But it happens in a riding where you say, well, how do you get access to the central system, which is supposedly you have to have a password? How does the company involved get access to the central system? How do you get access through the company? These are questions which are perfectly legitimate. And one has to say, and one of the first examples that I heard about was actually not involving the Liberal Party at all, but involving the Bloc Québécois in the riding of Rivière-du-Loup in the by-election of 2009, where we heard of an example where a call was made indicating it's a call from the Bloc. It wasn't a call from the Bloc. It was a call coming from somewhere else. How do we explain these phantom calls? How do we explain the number of phantom calls? And then there's a difference, Mr. Speaker, between a call which is dishonest and a call which is intended to suppress a vote, and then a call which is actually intended to misdirect someone, to tell someone a polling station is in place Y when in fact it's in place Z, somewhere else. How do we explain that? How do we explain the number of times that it's happened? Give me a computer and internet access and I can boom your house and cell phone from 3 continents away at the same time with the same or a different message. How do we track down this information? What if some of these calls were coming offshore? What if, in fact, they're offshore and off-book in terms of how they're financed? These are legitimate questions. Because when something happens once, you say it's an accident. When it happens twice, you say, well, let's look into it. When it happens dozens of times in dozens of ridings, there has to be some other explanation. Yep. There has to be some way of getting to the bottom of what it is. Exactly. And that's why I do think the government, if they're sincere in saying, let's get to the bottom of it, the party that can get to the bottom of it the easiest is the Conservative Party of Canada. The campaign team, the people working in the war room, the people who were working in the war room, which was specifically intended to deal with close ridings. I want to say to my Conservative friends, no one involved in this business of politics today can have anything but a grudging sense of admiration for the discipline and organization which goes into the Conservative campaigns. They have a central message. It is repeated over and over and over again. They have raised a lot of money, and that money is put into creating the greatest and latest technology that's available. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, and this is where we have to get to the bottom of it, what are the values of the people who are behind that technology and behind that impressive organization? That's the issue. And that's the issue that Elections Canada can get at from a certain perspective, but it's an issue which only the members of the Conservative Party can deal with themselves. Have they created a culture, Mr. Speaker, in which winning is everything? Have they created a culture in which they say, oh, you guys are just sore losers? Well, I would say, looking over the other side, they're just a bunch of sore winners. I mean, they don't let up. They are relentless in their determination to go forward the way they've gone forward. The way they went forward in 2006 with the in and out, with the brazenness with which they defied any questioning with respect to this subject. The brazenness with respect to they resisted Elections Canada and finally had to succumb to a subpoena.
Police raid.
Yeah, and a police raid in terms of seizing documents. Ça, c'est la question, Monsieur le Président.
That's the question, Mr. Speaker. What are the real values behind the big machine? As a professional politician, we see a machine, and we have to admit that it's a very professional one. It's a machine that is well controlled from the center. But the fact that it's well controlled from the center means that it's not likely that there be many accidents or other incidents in the ridings. And that's why we're insisting on answers to our questions. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, we're not going to let this go.
Mr. Speaker, it is not a pleasant subject because we are constantly having to ask questions about things that we can't quite believe could be happening. And they're not based on, as the words of my colleagues opposite keep saying, they're not based on unsubstantiated smears. They're based on complaints coming from Canadian citizens. Exactly. They're based on complaints coming, and the member opposite shouts out just now, too late. Well, I have news. I have news for that member. I have news for that member. It is never too late for justice and truth to come out. It is never too late. It is never too late. It is never too late for people to bring forward complaints. It is very important for people to recognize that someone who gets a call early in the campaign and is asked, who are you going to vote for, and either declines to answer or says none of your business because the call is coming from the Conservative Party, and then 2 days before the election receives another call saying, oh, your polling station is in Kalamazoo. What do you expect people to draw a conclusion from? And when they hear and they read about other people getting these calls, they say, I got that call too. That's why we have an absolutely unprecedented number of complaints coming into Elections Canada. And one thing the Conservative Party is going to have to come to grips with, it is not a matter of what the Liberal Party thinks or does, or what the NDP thinks or does in this matter, or what the Bloc or the Green Party thinks or does. It's about the Canadian people and what they think. It's about the forms that they're signing. It's about the things that they're saying. The argument of the Conservative Party is not with the Liberal Party and it's not with the NDP. It's with the Canadian people.
Shame.
And they have to understand that. And as they reposition themselves for the umpteenth time, and as their talking points shift the blame from one party to another party to somewhere else, they have to look into their own hearts and minds and ask themselves a simple question. Have we not done something here which we should not have done? Mr. Speaker, I make no bones about it. This is an unprecedented situation, to quote from Mr. Kingsley. We are literally in uncharted waters. Those so-called experts or others who say, oh, there's nothing to all of this stuff, I don't think they really understand the implications of what happens when bad values and good technology get all mixed up in the same lethal cocktail. This is what happens. This is what happens, Mr. Speaker, and this is why Elections Canada needs to have these additional powers. I'm glad the Conservatives have backed away from their previous position and done a 180 on this issue. It's time that they did. But we need to make sure that it applies not to future elections, but to this election. Exactly. We need to make sure that it applies to what's happened in these campaigns. And so I look forward to those discussions. Mr. Speaker, we've gone from the serving of beef and the serving of beer, from nylons and rum, to where we are today. And it's something that we have to come to grips with as Canadians. Corruption is corruption is corruption. It shouldn't happen wherever it happens, and we have to deal with it today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Minister of State for Democratic Reform.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the leader of the Liberal Party for his speech today. And during his speech, he talked about the fact that members of a specific religious, specific religion received phone calls at a time that was not respectful. And on the phone, they said that they were representing the Liberal Party. And very respectfully, very sincerely, I asked the leader of the Liberal Party that the fact that they themselves, and he admits that the Liberal Party spent millions of dollars on hundreds of thousands of phone calls across the country, isn't it possible, isn't it just possible that the source of those phone calls that claim to be Liberals were actually the phone calls that they were making? And wouldn't it just make sense for them, as the Liberal Party, to provide all the information regarding those calls to Elections Canada? The Conservative Party is assisting Elections Canada. We've provided information. Why doesn't the Liberal Party do the same?
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Well, first of all, we are. Secondly, the reason the Conservative Party is cooperating so profusely with Elections Canada is because they have a subpoena that requires them to do so. They have to produce documents. This is not something they ran over the street and said to Elections Canada, we'll do it quite gladly. They have a court order telling them that they have to do it. That's what they have. They have a court order that, with respect to the production of documents under the Criminal Code of Canada. That's why they have to do it. That's the reason they're doing it. And let me say, with respect to the issue that I raised, the reason, I know the Minister was listening carefully, the reason that I raised the example of the member from Mount Royal is because, first of all, these calls were not robocalls, they were calls made in person. Second of all, they were calls that the member from Mount Royal did not have his office open and was not making any calls with respect to that situation, and no one else was making calls on his behalf with respect to that situation. So that's an extremely clear and categorical answer that I can give to the honourable member. But also say to him that, of course, everyone here is going to be cooperating with Elections Canada. There's a little bit of a difference between cooperating with Elections Canada and being required to do so because of a court subpoena, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Hamilton Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I knew that would happen someday. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity. Let me say, first of all, that it feels somewhat strange and familiar to be on side with the honourable member on a file. Let me first of all reaffirm that we will be strengthening this motion. I committed to that last night publicly. I did this morning at the news conference. I will again. We will be strengthening this so that it applies to past elections as well as present. Any file in front of the Chief Electoral Officer, this new law would apply to those files and they could use it at their discretion. My question is this. To sort of get back up to a macro view of all this, the honourable member is very well travelled in the world, has a very sophisticated, civilized world view. Him and I were recently in Morocco together as international election observers, helping them with their election. I would ask the honourable member what he thinks all of this and the other actions of this government are doing to the great reputations that Canadians are proud of in terms of the damage to that very proud reputation that we have.
The Honourable Member for Toronto Centre.
Well, I think it's doing its share of damage, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I think that we're all watching how politics is practiced in a number of countries. It's interesting to me how a number of the consultants who work for the Conservative Party, as well as consultants who work for other parties, are all in fact doing international work. They're doing work in Israel, they're doing work in the UK, they're doing work in Australia, it's troubling because you see these things happening and these techniques and philosophies being applied. Voter suppression, which is in itself wrong, and even worse than that is voter misinformation. So I think this is a very serious question for Canada's reputation. We have a great deal of confidence in Elections Canada, unlike the government, who've refused to vote for a motion indicating our support and confidence in Elections Canada. So I think it's a very serious question the member poses.
Question and comment.
Questions and comments of the honourable member for Ottawa-Vanier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's another concern that we should all have. Often, we are called upon to travel abroad to encourage democracy in certain countries, to encourage the multi-party system, and even to participate as observers in elections. Could the member for Toronto Centre comment on the impact that this type of situation that we are currently experiencing in Canada could have on our reputation abroad? The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party. I believe that's a very important question, and I share the viewpoint of the member who asked the question. We must remember, I began my speech talking about the Canadian system that we created. In my riding, we're allowed to spend up to $80,000. But when I refer to this situation to my American colleagues, they cannot believe that that is the Canadian system. I say, yes, it is, that there are limits to the amount of money that can be spent by individuals. We don't receive money from unions or corporations. It is only individuals who can contribute. So that is the system that the Prime Minister of Canada does not accept. He wants to create a system where money can buy anything and where money counts and nothing else. And I am someone who believes that the system that we have created here in Canada is a good system, and that we must do everything in our power to keep that system in place, Mr. Speaker.
It's the honourable member for Medicine Hat.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I listened quite intently to the member from Toronto Centre, and particularly when he talked about now is the time to get back and to follow this through. Canadians won't forget. And so one of the comments I have in terms of the Liberal Party of Canada, Mr. Speaker, is that in fact, the ad scam. There were brown envelopes, money missing, and there's still $40 million missing. And I know that they would love to help get that funding back. However, there's a couple other comments I'd like to make, Mr. Speaker, before I ask my question. First of all, I know that there's some left-leaning websites out there that some opposition MPs are tied to who are encouraging all of these 31,000 contacts. And I also understand that the Liberal Party, and this is my question, Mr. Speaker, that the Liberal Party has a machine that does do their centralized calling as well. And so I would ask the honourable member if in fact that they are doing this, and are they going to provide those records to Elections Canada as well? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable leader of the Liberal Party.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the Liberal Party has a machine, it's avoided my detection over the last couple of years. What we have, Mr. Speaker, as I assume the New Democrats do, I'm not familiar with what systems they use now, is we have a number of contractors who also make calls. We've indicated publicly, we indicate to the honourable member, we're going to be sharing all of that information with Elections Canada, just as I understand you are doing as well. The difference between you and us is that you're doing it because you're under subpoena. We're doing it voluntarily, Mr. Speaker.
Just to remind all honourable members that it's not the chair that is sharing this information, and he ought to direct his comments in this direction. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honour to address a question to the Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party. In the context of this motion, and he made reference to the fact that we've seen previous election campaigns in blips, shall we say, of instances of election crime, essentially, in having calls that misdirected, purporting to be from the bloc when they weren't. The most comprehensive example of a previous election fraud effort was in Saanich Gulf Islands in 2008, in which robocalls were made to NDP supporters to get out and support a candidate who was actually no longer in the race. This allegedly and certainly arguably changed the result of the election and denied a Liberal their seat. The NDP were so upset in Saanich Gulf Islands by the fact of this crime that even though it was a Liberal Party candidate who was the biggest victim, they filed a complaint to Elections Canada. The Liberals filed complaints. Elections Canada simply didn't get to the bottom of it. And I'd like to ask the honourable member for Toronto Centre if it's too late to go back to what's essentially a cold case and figure out who stole the election in 2008 in Saanich Gulf Islands.
The honourable member for Toronto Centre, short answer, please.
Well, the simple hard fact is that a lot of calls are hard to trace. And it's no accident that they're hard to trace. Particularly offshore calls are hard to trace. It wouldn't be difficult to place offshore calls into Saanich Gulf Islands. This is something that we all have to come to grips with. In the world of technology today, to repeat the quote that I made before, in this world today, all you need is a computer and access to the internet, and you can have access to all kinds of things, and it's very difficult to trace them. And I think that's something that we have to take a hold of. I think one of the issues that we need to look at is making sure that all of the calls that are made not only are reported to Elections Canada, but in fact we keep a record of those calls for an extended period of time, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise de...
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Quebec